Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. Today, I have one of the rare repeat guests, one of the rare people to put on their CV that they were good enough to be invited for a second time to Saad Truth. Professor Eric Kaufman. How you doing, sir?
God, great. It's good to be here. And I'm glad that I'm one of the Hall of Fame that has managed to get in more than once.
You are indeed. I just checked before we came on. The inaugural time you came on was April 3rd, 2023. Much has happened since, which I want to get into. But just for the people who don't know who you are, you're Professor Eric Kaufman, Professor of Politics at University of Buckingham, which I was fortunate enough to visit last month. We'll talk about that. And you are also the founder and director of the Center for Heterodox Social Science, which comes with a new MA and a new PhD. We'll talk about that. Anything else you want to add to the bio before we get going?
Well, I have my book, which you probably can see just over my shoulder, and that's The Third Awakening 2024, which is really all about woke and how it got here.
Right, which in a sense is going to lead up to the Buckingham Manifesto, which we're going to talk about. Yes?
Right, yeah, I think I like to think of it as the companion volume to The Parasitic Mind and to the new book on suicidal empathy, actually, which is really I'm looking forward to.
Oh, thank you so much. It's funny because I wake up every morning filled with so much impatience because
Oh,
I am seeing the reaction that people are getting to suicidal empathy, which dare I say is even more orgiastic in its fervor than the parasitic mind. So if this is any good indication, I may be able to retire in Newport Beach, California soon. Anyways, let's first begin with last time you were on 2+ years ago. You were at University of London. You've now moved to the University of Buckingham, where you founded all sorts of new cool things. Tell us about this move and what are some, things you want to add to that transition.
Yeah. Well, I think, Gad, like you, I'm one of a small band of, non-progressive scholars in the social sciences, broadly conceived. So we're on the move now, aren't we? I was at Birkbeck, University of London for 20 years, and I was 4 years at the University of Southampton, so 24 years in the mainstream system. Um, and then University of Buckingham, which of course Britain's first, one of the very few private universities founded by Thatcher, has a free market tradition, very different from the mainstream in that. And I just thought it was about time I put my money where my mouth was and go to a different institution. And I'd also had, some run-ins, the internal investigations, the Twitter mobbings, the open letters, all these sorts of things you're familiar with. And so between that and the opportunity at Buckingham, I thought it was time to make a move. And so I set out this new Center for Heterodox Social Science, which we'll talk about because that's kind of the context for the conference and manifesto, which came later, and which you were kind enough to attend, really.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. So let's talk about that, and then we can get into the actual official manifesto that came out recently. I think it was published in the Chronicles of Higher Education. Is that what?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think someone has rebutted it, and then that person is soliciting some replies to it, which I've so far ignored. But in any case, so June 4th, I think there was a Is Woke Dead conference at the Emmanuel Center in London, which you were kind enough to invite me to. And then the following day, we all headed up to University of Buckingham for, I think, the original first fully sort of anti-woke academic conference ever. Is that a true statement?
I think that is a true statement, absolutely. And I think it's important to now that we're starting to get some new initiatives happening on the non-progressive side. So we had the June 4th event that yourself, Matt Goodwin, and Batya Ungar Sargon spoke at, which was before the conference the next day, which was on heterodox social science. It's worth saying for the audience we have got a free speech infrastructure now of organizations like FIRE and the Free Speech Union and others who are defending academics. Uh, we had the Stanford Academic Freedom Conference. We've got the Heterodox Academy Conference. We have a number of conferences and we have that conference out at University of Southern California, I believe, where people are talking about the problem of free speech and ideological conformity in academia. But what I wanted to do with this is to say, okay, we've now outlined the problem. What is the positive thing we need to do? And that is a new research agenda and a new intellectual movement. So this is a really the whole point of my post-progressivism article and this conference is to sketch out what I call a post-progressive intellectual movement and agenda. It's a bit like think of it as a non-progressive postmodernism. Um, but instead of postmodernism, we're saying we're not postmodern, but we are beyond the last 60 years, which is really the progressive period in which the cultural left has completely come to completely dominate high culture, intellectual life universities. We need to have an agenda which is post-progressive, which says actually that progressive movement has restricted the pursuit of truth by setting out taboos and red lines beyond which you're not allowed to go. So you can't say people's minds are parasitized. It's just, um, so essentially doing more or less off-piste or politically incorrect social science that is rebalancing. So what we're doing is we're trying to rebalance social sciences towards truth because they've gone away from truth and in favor of ideology. Ideology tells you what you're allowed to research and which perspective. So any disparity between, black and white or between men and women can only be explained by systemic racism and sexism. You can't say, well, actually, can we at least look at family structure? Can we look at, you say evolutionary psychology,
Exactly.
choices men and women make, these sorts of things. Um, if we really want to understand the phenomenon, we're going to need to actually bring these other explanations in. So that's really part of the mission is heterodox social science or countercultural social science. And the other part of it is we need to be studying woke as an ideology like any other. The way, if you, I'm a co-editor of a journal of nationalism studies where after the Berlin Wall came down, this scholarly association and journal was set up, and you had a boom in studies of nationalism, thousands of articles, books, conferences, courses. If academia was functioning properly, the explosion of woke would have led to the same thing. But you're not going to find courses on woke, except my course, open online course on woke. You're not going to find that at universities. And so why not? Well, because it's too uncomfortable to study. It's off limits. So the two things we need to do, countercultural social science and what I call critical woke studies. And that's the research agenda, the intellectual agenda at the conference and for the manifesto.
Right. I mean, and there are several reasons for why we are I mean, in French you say le pétrin, like in the trouble pit that we're in right now. One of it, I mean, there are many reasons. One is, of course, if you conflate activism versus the pursuit of truth, right? I mean, there's nothing inherently non-scientific about sociology, epistemologically speaking. I mean, Auguste Comte argued in the hierarchy of sciences that sociology should be at the apex because it is a lot more difficult to study human beings than it is to study, chemical compounds. And he's exactly correct. The problem arises because sociologists don't view their fundamental objective as one to pursue truth, but rather I have to be an activist. And so it's in that sense that sociology is tainted, not because psychology or sociology are any less. So that there's that problem. Another problem, which is an infrastructural one, is that if 95, 98, 99% of the professors are leftists, even if you and I are, proud signatories of the Buckingham Manifesto, are you ever able to flip it? And then, of course, there are other reasons that the parasitic stuff that I talk about, social scientists are afraid to argue that human beings are driven by biological imperatives and so on. Do you see any of these three that I just mentioned, and there are a few other reasons, as one is more, we better solve the lopsidedness and biased professoriate before we get, or are they all equally problematic and it has to be a multi-pronged approach?
Well, okay, yeah, I think that our aim shouldn't in the short term be 50-50 in academia between right and left. I think that's unrealistic. But I think what's more realistic is to say we can approach a more balanced picture in terms of the influence on the dominant ideas of society.
Yes.
And actually, what the way to attain that is we have to create a parallel ecosystem of new universities, new centers, new networks and then we need to amplify the cultural production of those networks because most academic papers are never cited. The vast majority are never cited. So we don't actually need to reproduce all of the stuff sitting on the dusty shelves. We need to, however, anything that is produced by the dissidents needs to be amplified to the point where it really influences uh, debates that policymakers and journalists are having. And I kind of see an alliance between the dissident academics and some of the kind of new media that's out there, new podcast media that can amplify this research. And so actually it should be possible to have the same influence with with 1/20th the number or 1/10th the number of academics. I still think it should be possible, but we need to be much smarter and more nimble about it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is create a repository of non-progressive social science that can be searched within AI by journalists and by policymakers. I'm trying to get some funding for that. So what that will allow people to do is say, well, we want to bypass, say, ChatGPT or some other AI that'll just direct us to the usual stuff. We can go to this portal and we can find the argument against systemic racism as the explanation for the racial wealth gap. Something like that. Can we come to a system where we've created a separate ecosystem linking dissenting academics like you with um, people in think tanks, people in new media, new universities that can have an amplification and change the culture? So I think that's probably our best bet. I don't think we're gonna suddenly have academia be 50-50.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I mean, that's the exact reason why very early I saw the value and power of setting up my own show. This was way before it was cool to have podcasts, right? I mean, everybody and their mother has a
I
podcast. Right?
know.
But when I first came out, I was, dare I say, probably maybe the first professor to actually have these long format chats and so on, because I thought, well, wait a minute. Exactly to your point, the modal number of times that a paper is cited in academia is, drum roll, zero. Zero, right? I mean, yes, there are these stellar papers that end up getting cited after 10 years, 8,000 times. But the average paper, and by the way, this is not an indictment on the value of producing knowledge. Both you and I are academics in our core, but life also involves trade-offs, as the great Thomas Sowell explained to us. So I can write a trade book that will be read by hundreds of thousands of people, or I could publish my 97th academic paper, which, if I'm lucky, it'll be read by 30 people. Well, life is short. I've got to make a decision. So I exactly agree with you. And that's why I love having these conversations, because I'll post this up and within, an hour or two on X, there'll be 65,000 people who viewed it. So do you think that a lot of academics, whether they are parasitized or not, are starting to realize the importance of these new media, or are they still stuck in their stay in your lane sort of vision?
I think most are still stuck in the stay in your lane because they're used, it's comfortable. I think there's also another interesting dynamic though, which speaks to what you're doing, and that is I heard somewhere that for example, the statistic that if you go to law school in the Ivy League and you're a Republican, your chances of clerking in the Supreme Court are something like 14 times higher because the demand is kind of roughly 50-50, but the supply is so heavily on the left out of those law
Right.
schools. that if you happen to be in the minority, you're doing very well. And similarly with nonfiction books, I think a similar pattern where the pattern of books that are actually consumed is more balanced than the producers of the book. So and so it's true then that, for podcasting, most of the political podcasts in the US that are popular are actually on the right. And I think there is some truth in that there's a big demand with very few people to fill it. And so it's quite a good opportunity for people like you who are filling that particular niche to get your ideas out there. So I think all we need to do is, in fact, connect the small number of producers with this quite large demand to have the same influence. Now, of course, someone can always say, if you're just a podcaster and you have no credentials, someone might say, oh, well, you're just a podcaster. I think that's a dishonest way to argue, but they can say that. I do think we need to have some academic heft behind this alternative media think tank sphere. So it is useful to have the alternative academia. I do think we need it people who know the literature, who know the methods, can produce the deep research. I think that's going to be necessary. We can't just have somebody's take on today's events. Um, but I think we don't need to reproduce all of academia. As you say, most of academia is either salami slicing off the same very tired old ideas, or or, or just never getting cited. So we just need to have better amplification and maybe better coordination.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, we've already touched upon many of the ideas behind the Buckingham Manifesto, but give
Yeah.
us the specific definition of what this manifesto is, and then eventually in the description section, I'll put a link. Now, is the link to the actual manifesto behind the paywall, or is it publicly available? What?
No, there's a really the Chronicle is paywalled, but I've also got it on a Google Doc that anybody who's an academic or graduate student can sign. So we are taking
Okay.
signatures.
Okay, perfect.
I'll send that over to you so it's perfectly public. But yeah, there's really the manifesto is really just following from the conference. It's two things. It's that we need to do what you might call politically incorrect or countercultural social science to rebalance the production of knowledge, which has become heavily warped. And the second thing is we need to do critical woke studies. In other words, study woke as an ideology, the way we would study fascism or communism or any other ideology. That's a research agenda, and we've already got, as I mentioned in the manifesto, we already have competing schools of thought. We have, the people who say it is all about status and dividing the working class. That's why we have woke,
Yeah,
Vivek Ramaswamy or Rob Henderson, and then we have the people who say, no, it's a religion, it's a true belief. And that's perhaps a bit closer to also I
right,
think, to your position.
right.
Um, and then we also have arguments over, did this arise in the 2010s or did it arise in the 1960s, which is my view and Chris Rufo's view. So you have these competing schools of thought already. This is a discipline, and so it needs to be recognized as such. And so it's a research agenda. So that's really the two prongs. I'm kind of using this term post-progressivism to kind of scaffold this enterprise because I do think there's a sense in which cultural leftism has come to the end of the road. Trans is its Waterloo in a way. I'm not saying everybody recognizes that, but I think even the proponents, they're just defending turf now. I don't think
Yeah.
they're actually taking it to the next level. And I think a lot of even the center leftists now are starting to back away from elements of it. So I think it's kind of reached its apogee. And so I think we should put a bookmark down and say that was the era of the cultural left. It dominated intellectual life. What's the next era going to look like? The post-progressive era. And two parts of that are going to be this new social science and the critical woke studies.
So two questions. First, one you already alluded to when you
Yeah.
referenced Christopher Rufo. He recently came out with the Manhattan Statement, which I was also a proud signatory of that statement. What are some, does the Buckingham Manifesto and the Manhattan Statement feed off each other? Do they complement each other? I mean, of course they complement each other, but
All
what
right.
are the similarities? What are the differences? Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and then I'm also also a signatory of both. The Manhattan Statement is more of a political and legislative, let's just say it's a policy manifesto.
Yeah,
This is what government should do, or the Trump administration should do. Whereas the Buckingham Manifesto is an intellectual
exactly.
manifesto. This is what intellectuals should do. And one of the reasons you can see, one way you can see the difference is you can see intellectual opponents. Chris Rufo, Steven Pinker are both signatories of the Buckingham Manifesto. Now, those two don't agree on much, but they do agree on this. I was quite pleased. It was an aim to try and get both of the and there's a few there's a number of liberals, Yasha Monk and Claire Lehman, and then you have conservatives both signing up to this manifesto because I think both your liberals who don't want to see government interference and who believe in university autonomy, they are very opposed to the social justice agenda and conformity, as well as the people like myself and like yourself who think that without government pressure, these institutions will never change. And which is really, I think, I should say that in regard to the Manhattan Statement, I have a debate out now in Inside Higher Education with an opponent of the Manhattan Statement, as this guy John Wilson. So that came out today. Um, I wasn't that convinced by the
Oh,
reply, but
that's
yeah.
forgive me for interrupting. That's the guy that I was thinking about
Okay,
when
okay.
I said I've been ignoring it. I mistook it as that guy being for the Buckingham. It's for
Oh
the other one. You're
yeah.
right. Thank you. Go on.
Yeah, yeah. I think the Buckingham one is who knows? It may become debated. I have a reply. I have to reply to one journalist, but I think it's more likely that this will be what I'm hoping is that this gets debated in academic journals. Because I'm kind of we're trying to reach into academia.
Yeah.
And so what I'm anticipating is we'll send this, we're going to do an edited book as well, and you'll undoubtedly be contacted on that. But the aim is to try and get something in the academic world, get it attacked, as it no doubt will be. But once something is attacked, it's inside the system, and they're
Yeah.
having to deal with it.
Yeah.
So
Beautiful.
that's the goal.
Well, I said that I had two questions. One was the Christopher Rufo Manhattan Statement. The second
Yeah.
one, which in a sense you're sort of alluding to, because I was going to ask you what are some of the next steps? One, you said it, edited book, but then the most obvious next one would be, are you thinking of founding a new journal of post-progressive social science?
Well, that's a good question. So it's not something I'm personally thinking of doing. I will say that we have now just recently, and you saw at the conference, there are some journals which I think are essentially doing post-progressive social science. So Theory and Society, which is a
Yes.
venerable journal. One of the founders was Alvin Gouldner, who is one of the originators of the term new class, which also is a euphemism for the professional managerial class. So yeah, but that journal now under the editorship of Kevin McCaffrey, I think is a great home for post-progressive social science. Lee Jussum's Soib's journal, Journal of Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. So we've got a few journals.
Yeah.
I don't think I can or want to replicate that. One thing I am doing is I managed to get some money for a grants program in countercultural social science, so that we will be advertising try and get projects that are going to be working towards the two aims of the manifesto. And then we got the edited book and then the special issue of Theory and Society. So we're
Yes.
trying to make that impact in the academic world to try and just say, no, in fact, you can't just go on assuming that you are the world. There is a challenger, which you will have to deal with in some way. I think that's the beginning.
Yeah, if you mentioned theory and society, one of
Yeah.
the many wonderful interactions that I had at your conference in Buckingham was with Kevin, who approached me, and we had a very long conversation. And yes, there's this special issue that's coming out, but he also invited me to submit my evolutionary psychology stuff with the hope of Darwinizing the field of sociology. And if Kevin hears this, I hope he appreciates how much I felt invigorated by his I mean, he's a bit younger. He's probably in his 40s, but he's very, very driven, very much wishing to make big changes as you are. And so there is something that is so soothing. I'm not saying anything that's not obvious, but to meet fellow like-minded people, not because you're trying to create an echo chamber, but because when you've spent, in my case, 31 years fighting against nearly everybody in sight, and suddenly I go to a conference where people come up to you for all sorts of different reasons saying, "Hey, thank you for your work." Uh, it can't help but feel good. And so again, I can't stress enough how wonderful it was to be at that conference. So thank you for organizing it.
Thank you. It was wonderful. It was just great to have you there, and the energy I thought was just
It really
tremendous.
was. And you
And
have a
it,
vice chancellor that's rather affable in his offbeatedness, if I can put it that way.
I know. Yeah, it's great to have a leader of the university be that enthusiastic, and because normally I think presidents and vice chancellors would be sort of pedaling away as quickly as they can.
Yeah.
So he's trying to very much behind it. But the other thing too is it's also important to have these kind of events. Like if you look at self-censorship amongst staff and students, it's driven mainly by peers actually, or perceptions of peers. And so even if you have the best University of Chicago trifecta principles, you're still going to have massive self-censorship. And so when you have a forum like this where people can speak freely, can be creative and not have to worry about looking over their shoulder, I think that's a great environment. Now, that doesn't mean you don't also have, we might have in the future, it may be that, you have an environment where the kind of woke mainstream and the countercultural may have a forum where they get together. And I've been in some of these forums and they have their own dynamic. So it's useful to have, like I know Johns Hopkins is doing something like that. So you can have the neutral ground where the two sides meet and disagree. That's useful, but it's also useful to have your own show where people can feel free to research what they want.
Yes, on a personal level, may I say that I guess you call them chips, but they're these very, very big potatoes in downtown, if we could call it a downtown, because it's a small sort of quaint village, in downtown Buckingham, that I might return to Buckingham, not to see you, but only to have those fries. Do you know by the way which place I'm talking about?
I don't. I'm curious. You got
It's
me
owned
curious
by
as to.
a Portuguese couple. Uh,
Oh,
I mean,
is it a small place? Is
it's
it a
a small
small?
it's a small place. It's a fish and chips place. My wife and
I
I walked in there. We didn't get the fish. We only got the chips. And we ordered a large, but the large was enough to feed an entire Russian battalion. So what ended up happening, actually, a gentleman from the conference, whom I didn't know who he was, but he knew me, came up to us to introduce himself, and he ended up sharing in this orgiastically large chips. So I'll have to try to find the place for you because if you ever return there, I know you're a very slim, healthy guy, but you really need to partake in that Epicurean delight.
I that wow. I think if you use the term orgiastic about chips, that
That something is right.
I
Uh,
know.
oh,
I think I know the place because I've been in there once, and I'm gonna have to go back for the chips.
very good. What are some projects that you're currently working on, whether it be with some of your MA or PhD students in these two new programs that you founded at University of Buckingham, or anything else
Yeah.
beyond what we've talked about that you'd like to share?
Well, I have, yeah, some more academic projects. So one thing I'm looking at is the very strong correlation between among young people between being very left-wing ideologically, being non-heterosexual, particularly bisexual or queer, and mental illness. Now, so if we're talking about, let's step away from value judgments and just say, I can tell you that ideology, sexual orientation, and mental health are essentially so heavily correlated in the student data, the FIRE 50,000, there's 60,000 sample student data, that one underlying factor explains half the variation in those three
Wow.
variables. So, look, now, I mean, there's just this ridiculously high correlation. And so that's one area where I'm kind of working on that. Not a hot potato or anything. A little bit less, yeah. Also, this question of trust in universities, which has declined among Republicans, especially in the US. And one of the things you see is I'm trying to understand the connection between what people think academics, the makeup of academia politically and their trust in academia. And what you kind of see is that Republicans who think academia is heavily Democrat are very untrusting, unsurprisingly, of professors. And it kind of turns out that a lot of people don't realize just how left-wing academia is. So the average Republican thinks that social science and humanities professors are almost 40%, or somewhere between a third and 40% Republican. Um, so, so actually, if they actually knew the correct proportion, would that even lead to a greater suspicion of universe? I mean, this is just from an empirical standpoint, right? And so I'm kind of looking into this data through surveys. So I'll present that in the American Political Science Association in Vancouver this summer, or in September. So that's something else that I'm looking at.
Oh, very nice. I have a project that I started. I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, just shortly after Parasitic Mind came out, I wanted to test some empirical ideas I had. And so I had a master's student who wanted to, who asked that I supervise him. And so what I pitched to him was the idea of studying, I mean, several things, but one of which, I don't know if you remember the male feminist as sneaky effers section in my book.
Oh, yeah, yes, that's right. Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So for our viewers and listeners who don't know what this is, so
yeah.
the concept of sneaky effers, fuckers, is a zoological term from the 1970s. The formal term is kleptogamy, which is the stealing of mating opportunities, where you typically have different phenotypes of males in a species. There's the dominant phenotype, like the dominant male phenotype, but then there's another male that mimics the morphology and behavior of a female, hoping to cause the dominant male to let this guy through, and then he can surreptitiously engage in some sneaky effing. And so I took that idea and the parasitic mind, and I said, aha, I believe that the male feminists and the supra empathetic, social justice warriors are applying that zoological strategy in the human context, hence male feminists as sneaky efforts. And so then I decided with this graduate student, I said, well, why don't we actually test some of these ideas? There is some research that's already published, not by me, by others, that shows that, for example, your physical formidability correlates to your political and economic orientation, which itself is a fascinating
I
finding,
know.
which I cite in the parasitic mind. So, for example, men who are physically more formidable are less likely to be for social or economic egalitarianism because they obviously realize that humans are a hierarchical species. Some of us are tougher than others. Some of us are more likely to win competitions than others. And that's the natural order of things. But if I'm a small, wimpy guy who cries every second, then I want there to be equality. I want there to be some supra force that removes those mechanisms that make me be at the lower end of the hierarchy. And so, what I was supposed to do with the student, I say suppose as if it's in the past tense, and I'll explain in a second why that is. So, one of the things that we were testing is I asked them to run a study where we would show various morphologies of people, of men, and then ask people which of these men would be most likely to support these various parasitic ideas that I enumerate in the book. And I thought, boy, once we run these studies,
Yeah.
get ready, the media is going to stop. Never mind the media. I think it would be really a cool scientific study. Now, here's the bad part of this. As regrettably often happens with graduate students, they get sucked into a black hole of which they never return. So this project, which as far as I know, he had reported to me that he had ran the data, I mean, collected the data and ran it. I haven't heard from the student from nearly 2 years, and I'm assuming at this point he's dropped out. I have two other PhD students with whom I spent probably hundreds, if not thousands of hours supervising them, who've also disappeared. So one of the biggest frustrations I have had in my career is to, nurture these students for really hundreds, if not thousands of hours, and then regrettably they disappear. But if he resurfaces, I think I've got a whole bunch of studies that very much fit within your post-progressive social science framework.
Well, I hope to see them. I mean, this is the thing, yeah, with graduate students. I've got some quite interesting ones now, um, attracted by, the program, so which is just fascinating research. But there's always this issue of whether they will complete. So you're saying they just dropped out because they didn't have the money or the time, or,
No,
they just,
just they, yeah. I don't know. I don't think it's the money. I think they just get sucked into you know, being a graduate student is a difficult transition, even though you
yeah.
had previously been a very good student in the sense that, you did well, you were studious, you got A's, because it's the first time where you're being asked not to retain and master other people's knowledge, but now you have an empty paper where it's incumbent on you to fill in that knowledge, right? And for some people, they could be very, very bright, very talented, but they can't make that switch. And so maybe I'm speculating, but my sense is that for a lot of the students who've been sucked into a black hole, at least in my case, what happens is they flounder. And I've always struggled with whether there is any part of that that's due to me in my supervisory strategy. I'm infinitely nurturing in that if
Mhm.
you ask, as a matter of fact, I will often be the one who is driving the research, right? Like they come to me, Professor, give me a research topic, right? So it's
Right,
not
right.
as though I'm not willing to mentor you fully, but I'm not someone who will call you every 48 hours and say, what have you done? So if you happen to then get sucked into a black hole, I might send one email, two emails, three emails, but then I will back away. But I don't know. Maybe I should be sending an email every Tuesday. What are your thoughts on that?
Very hard. I mean, I think most supervisors are fairly hands off, and it's up to the student. And you give feedback when they submit things. They should be responding to the comments. That doesn't always happen. But there's not a whole lot you can do. It has to come from the student. I think
Exactly.
the PhD, especially PhD. Now you have these processes where you have to fill out reports every year and things. So they have to kind of show what they've done each year. But if a student wants to spend money and spend years and years, I mean, there, there are processes now they're trying to crack down on it a little bit, but
Yeah.
some people just enjoy the process of being a student. Um, there's not much you can do.
That is
That's-
true. That is true. So how have you so far, since we're talking about graduate students, given these two new programs, the master's and PhD that you've instituted at University of Buckingham, have you
yeah.
had any students that have completed the programs, or is it so new that no one is out of the pipeline yet?
Yeah, it's so new. It's the first year. So we have two who will complete, and I think they will complete this year, but two MA students. But the obviously it's the first year, so and even some of the masters are on a part-time basis, so they'll run for 2 years. So yeah, we're just at the beginning. Um, but teaching is a part of it. But I'd say the research agenda is in many ways, a major part of this too, is having a program that you want more researchers to work in these areas and to know about each other, connect with each other, hopefully with conferences, certainly through networks. That's kind of the aim. So one of the things that's occurring in the US with these new schools of civic thought and the new centers, new universities, University of Austin, for example, Ralston College, is we have an emergence of a lot of teaching. When that's great, we have to have that. I mean, one of the questions is, are we producing new research? And there, I think it's much weaker, and there's a lot of work to be done. And so, hopefully, as this enterprise, as these new centers pop up, this will be a way of, in fact, trying to advance a research agenda, not just a teaching agenda.
Yeah, a couple of more questions and then I'll
Yeah.
let you go. Uh, you mentioned these new civic centers, and so I'll call them loosely freedom centers. So, for example, the current university that I'm still affiliated with, but for only a few more weeks, North. Uh,
Congratulations.
no, 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 not Concordia. I'm talking about Northwood
Hmm.
University. Uh,
Oh, sorry,
yeah, yeah,
sorry.
yeah, no worries. But Northwood University, which, by the way, I thought it would have been great for you. I tried to connect you with the president of Northwood, which I'm still hopeful that you guys will connect. They're very much founded on the principles of free enterprise, small, limited government, and so on. Now, that ethos, one can argue, is a different project from the one that we've been talking about, but you can also reconcile the two together. And so
Yeah.
there's now, I think, one at, yeah, of course, University of Austin uh, is trying to do this. There's, Florida International University has the Adam Smith Center. University of Florida has a kind of a freedom center and so on. Do you see these two projects, the proliferation of centers? For example, I visited Ole Miss, University of Mississippi. They have a new Declaration of Independence Center. Do you see these types of projects jiving well with the post-progressive social science project?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that in terms of higher education reform, the only way to bring viewpoint diversity in is through these centers. I just think having a bunch of scattered academics who are having to keep their mouths shut is just that's not gonna be enough. We have to have that as well, but we have to support them, but we need to have kind of ring-fenced zones where people can be free to th research what they want without fear. And so I think this is really extremely important. Now, the one criticism I have is that these schools of civic thought and the new universities are heavily focused on great books on the American Constitution and tradition, which is extremely important to pass on. I support that for the teaching enterprise in particular. But I think we also need to push back, not just in the humanities, but in the social sciences. We have to do research that starts to change the narrative about systemic racism and sexism being the reason for race and sex inequality, or talking, essentially, as Musa Al-Gharbi shows, 85% of papers in sociology are talking about inequality. I mean, that is just a ridiculous level of focus on an important problem, but only one problem. I mean, we should also be talking about social cohesion and integration, and how to reduce polarization and crime and other elements of social disorder, which are not really part of the mainstream agenda in the social sciences. So yeah, I would say that what's missing in the new centers is the social research part of it. I know that there are some social scientists in some of these centers, and they are trying, and I think it will develop, but it's at an early stage right now.
Beautiful. Uh, Last comment before I let you go. You've now entered the pantheon of the repeat guests, but I didn't want to denigrate your great accomplishment of being a repeat guest on the Saad Truth. Lord Matt Ridley has beaten you by being a three-time guest. So let's make sure to somehow
Okay.
put you into the schedule so that you can enter the truly rarefied pantheon of three-peat guests. Then you can put that proudly on your CV as your greatest accomplishment in your career. Yes?
Do I get a belt, like
You get a belt, you
WWF?
get whatever you want. You get a trophy. Well, I recently, not to toot my own horn, but I recently found out that I might be the most frequent guest on Joe Rogan, short of his like sort of comedy friends, but like I don't want to say more serious guests because I don't mean to imply that comedy is not serious business. But so maybe you'll be third, maybe fourth. My point is, you're always welcome to return. It's always a delight to talk to you. I look forward to hopefully seeing you soon again, either in Canada or the US or England. Keep doing your great work, and thank you so much for coming on the show, Eric.
Gad, it's been a pleasure as always, and I look forward to getting that belt.
Sounds good. Stay on the line. We'll say goodbye offline. Talk
Okay.
to you soon. Cheers.